This is lecture number 6, believe it or not, on RISSHO ANKOKU RON. That's on securing peace in the land through establishing the ultimate truth. And it'll probably take us another 4 lectures, I guess, to complete the whole gosho. So just to summarize a bit what has happened so far in the first 5 lectures. Going backwards, as it were, in the last lecture, we dealt with question number 3 and answer 3 in this gosho, which is made up of a series of question and answers between a traveler who is spending the night with somebody on his journey. So the host of the house he's called at is Nichiren Daishonin. And the traveler, you remember, is a man called Hojo, who at that time represented the most powerful person in Japan. He was actually an ex-regent, but behind the scenes he held the reins of power. And in presenting this remonstration to the authorities of Japan at that time, Nichiren Daishonin chose to do it in this way, in this sequence of questions and answers between a traveler and his host for the night. And in the last lecture, the matter that he handled in this question was why it was so essential for Nichiren Daishonin to admonish all those who were following and teaching distorted and incomplete teachings, ignoring the truth of the Lotus Sutra, which Shakyamuni himself had said was supreme. Before that, he'd begun, in the first part of the gosho, to point out the appalling state of the country at that time. I no need to go into the various disasters, both natural and man-made, which were occurring during that period. And of course, to that first part of the gosho, the traveler, the regent Hojo, heartily agreed. Then Nichiren Daishonin went on to say that the reason why these disasters were occurring was because the Buddhist gods, i.e. the benevolent forces of the universe, had left the land because the people were not following the true teachings and had become apathetic and hopeless about the future. And he said that they were being misled down this life of apathy and hopelessness because of the incorrect and incomplete teachings of various priests and monks. So in this part of the first part of the gosho, we were given a very vivid picture of the state of medieval Japan. And as we went on studying it, it became very clear to us that this picture of the misery and suffering in Japan at that time is now a reflection of what is going on in the world as a whole. So to lead up to what we're going to do now, it's important to consider why it was that these incorrect or incomplete teachings, as Nichiren Daishonin called them, were spreading such apathy and hopelessness. And the best example to take is the teaching known as nembutsu. And this indeed was the most widespread and rapidly growing teaching to take hold of the people's minds during that period. Nembutsu preached what is known as the doctrine of the pure land. That is to say, it taught that there was a paradise after death, which was known as the land of bliss. And Nembutsu said, if you devoted yourself not to Shakyamuni Buddha, but to a Buddha who lived in a pure land called Amida, you would go there without fail after your death. So how was a person to devote themselves to Amida Buddha? By chanting Nam Amida Butsu. That is to say, Nam, I devote myself to Amida Buddha. So this teaching was based on the doctrine of a Chinese sect that had been founded round about the year AD 500, and it was taken up by a priest, a Japanese priest called Honen. Honen died in 1212, that's to say about 50 or so years before this gosho was written. And during those 50 years, nembutsu spread like wildfire and led to the foundation of a sect called Jodo, or the Pure Land sect. Of course, it was popular because it was totally escapist. The state of Japan, as Nichiren Daishonin had described, was appalling. Terrible natural disasters with casualties and deaths on a huge scale were occurring twice, 3 times, 4 times a year. And there seemed no let-up whatsoever. So this doctrine of the Pure Land was an escape to something else beyond what you felt it was impossible to cope with. At the same time, however, it obviously bred a feeling of guilt and hopelessness. In other words, the sort of people who were saying, this situation is what I deserve and there's nothing I can do about it. So the only solution was to grit your teeth and bear it as being part of your karma until you died, and then hope that what the nembutsu teaching was true, you'd find yourself in this paradise, in the Pure Land in the West, the land of bliss. So rather than giving the masses of the people hope, which is what, of course, a religion should be doing, it subdued them and bred hopelessness so far as this life was concerned. So, of course, to Nichiren Daishonin, with his teaching of honimyo, of making the causes now for a great life in this lifetime, it was absolute anathema and nothing else but evil. Politically, too, this teaching was of value for those who wished to maintain power for themselves over a people who were subjugated by their own apathy and hopelessness. So in every sense, the teaching of nembutsu was breeding evil and had arisen from evil. This was what Nichiren Daishonin was trying to point out. So how had this man Honen achieved this? Of course, he'd seized on the misery of the times and exploited it by extracting 3 sutras which Shakyamuni had taught. They are known as the Pure Land Sutras. And he used them out of context with the rest of Shakyamuni's teachings, and particular, of course, with the Lotus Sutra. This was a deliberate distortion and slander. And Nichiren Daishonin points this out very carefully with detailed references during the course of the question and answer we'll study today. Furthermore, Honen denied Shakyamuni as being the Buddha to be revered. So in the light of the Lotus Sutra, these Pure Land Sutras were, of course, referring to the possibility of the state of Buddhahood after death through making effort to attain Buddhahood in this lifetime. And they referred to the assurance of Buddhahood after death and in future lives to come. But like all sutras, they take detailed study and take a lot of understanding. And it was quite simple for him to use this out of context with everything else that Shakyamuni taught and teach the teaching of the land of bliss. So as I say, the question and answer we deal with today concerns the refutation of nembutsu. So once more to remind you of the progress of Nichiren Daishonin's argument or case in this great gosho. First of all, to give a description of the state of Japan at that time. Then secondly, he shows the external cause for this situation. As you know, in Buddhism, we know that we are taught that there is both an external cause and an internal or inherent cause for everything that happens. So the external cause, which he showed and proved, was that the Buddhist gods had left the land due to the incorrect teachings, leading to the arising of the 3 calamities and 7 disasters, which had been clearly predicted in the teaching of the Lotus Sutra by Shakyamuni. Then he went on to point out the essential need to admonish those who were misleading the people. That is to say, the evil monks and priests who had followed Honen. Now, in this particular part of the gosho, he goes on to delve into the inherent cause for all that was occurring. And this inherent cause, he points out, is nothing else but slander of the true law. So in this question and answer, he attacks nembutsu strongly in order to show that this is nothing else but slander. Slander by Honen, this evil priest as he called him, which was then followed by slander on the part of the millions who followed his teaching, leading to the situation in Japan at that time. So the greatness of Buddhism, of course, is that it's able to cut through the external causes, which in a sense have no value to us, through deep down to the inherent cause behind those external causes. There are many practices and cults and sects today which play around with the external causes, saying to people, if you understand what you did in your past, then you can improve your present life and change your karma. But they refer only to the external causes. It's of no value to me or to you to know that you were a burglar in your last time, or Queen Isabella of Spain, or Adolf Hitler. Of no value whatsoever. What matters is, what was the inherent cause in your life which caused you to behave in the way that Adolf Hitler behaved, or the burglar behaved, or Queen Isabella of Spain, whoever she was? So, Hojo, the regent, or the ex-regent, the traveler, was actually himself supporting nembutsu, as were many other people in the government of that day. So after this question and answer, which we talk about today, he became mightily enraged and angry. And anger continues on his part for a large part of the rest of the gosho, while Nichiren Daishonin determinedly pursues his proof of what he is saying, until finally the man is convinced and goes away well and truly shakabuku'd. So of course there's nothing unusual in this anger on his part. We too, when we're teaching the true law, Buddhism of Nichiren Daishonin, or Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, encounter this sometimes. To teach the true law establishes a new dimension, doesn't it, to life? A new way of looking at things. This upsets the basis for people's judgment. The basis on which they have been judging things for all their lifetime. Therefore, inevitably, with some particularly strong-minded people, this causes a great stirring in their lives, a shaking and an upsetting. This is why sometimes when we teach others about Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, we get an angry reaction. So maybe some of you may be thinking, well, what really has nembutsu to do with us? And incidentally, I don't intend that we should study in detail today the teachings of nembutsu. Nembutsu may exist in one small pocket in this country, but it's of no significance. Yet it has a great deal to do with us, and a great deal to do with every people of the world today, because it's representative of a great many false and incomplete teachings which still exist in this world and pull the wool over the eyes of the people. The world is still full of them, and this is why the world is suffering at this very moment, and no doubt for some time to come, from the 3 calamities and 7 disasters. So this, of course, is the timeless message of the RISSHO ANKOKU RON, that everything that is wrong with this world can in the end be traced back to the wrong teaching, religion, or philosophy. So Marx said that religion was the opium of the people, and he was right in his day. Religion was an opium. In the Russian Orthodox Church, it was a means of giving hope for people, really, after they died, in the misery of life in Russia in those times. Christianity, too, when times were really grim or bad in a particular country, fell into the same trap and put emphasis on the greatness of the afterlife. Communism, another philosophy, through centralized power, provided its own opium in the end, in the form of propaganda, brainwashing, and delusion. So this is an evil which is historical as well as contemporary. And the RISSHO ANKOKU RON is as up-to-date as anything else for this present day, though it was written 700 or more years ago. So we'll go on now towards studying another part of the gosho, realizing this point, that it does apply to these very times that we live in, that the cause of disaster in the world is slander, due to the workings of the 3 poisons. Slander of the truth of life, or the law of life. Slander of respect for the dignity of life, which Buddhism points out is central to everything. Slander which is often started by erroneous or incomplete teachings. Sometimes the motivation behind those teachings is pure. Later they're distorted. Sometimes from the very beginning they may be distorted. So the teachers and the priests, of course, are the ones who most of all should be so careful about what they are spreading amongst the people. So why is it that these teachings apply such a, or exert such a hold on the minds of the people? It's usually due to the desperation of the times. Because of the desperation of the times, people will grasp and cling on to anything. In the case of Japan, in those medieval days, monks from China had brought with them not only teachings, not only, for example, the teachings of Honen, who founded the Nembutsu sect, but they'd also brought with them a great deal of knowledge. It was the monks from China who introduced such things as agricultural techniques, medicine, how to construct buildings, how to plan cities. It was the monks who brought this knowledge with them. And it was through this, rather than the teachings, that the people came to put their blind trust in them. Then, of course, they were ripe for exploitation through the teachings that were passed on. So in a sense, one could say the same, for example, for Africa. The Christian missionaries went there with a greater knowledge of modern techniques than the African people. And it was through this that they influenced the people and were then able to spread the teachings of Christianity. When I was in Hawaii a couple of weeks ago, attending the second SGI General Meeting, I was reading the history of those beautiful islands, and it explained that Captain Cook of the Royal Navy, when he arrived in Hawaii, was considered by the natives to be a god, because he was able to show them things which they never believed were possible. And of course the same applied not only to these remote places but also to Europe. The scholars and leaders of society in the early days, in the Middle Ages and so on, were leaders because they had greater knowledge than the people they were leading. And they were respected for that knowledge, for their brilliance. And therefore, through that power, they were able to impose teachings or philosophies on the people. Of course, I'm not saying that everything that was imposed was evil, not at all. So in, for example, this country, anyone who's been to Fountain Abbey in Yorkshire can see the relationship between the monks and priests and the people in those days. In that amazingly, wonderfully preserved ruin, you can see so clearly the very poor quarters at the bottom of the building, where the ordinary people and those who worked in the abbey as servants and so on lived, compared with the monks' quarters, which were on a higher floor and were places of much beauty. So the monks were above, looking down on the people. They had education. They knew how to build. They knew agricultural techniques. They knew a bit about medicine. And the people were subservient to them. And they exploited that subjugation. So even today, when you think about it, there are millions and millions of people who are absorbing everything, probably, that a powerful television personality is saying. This has distinct and strong influence on the minds of the people. Of course, I'm not saying that there is a proportion of people that don't think for themselves. Of course there is. But there are many who don't. So even in these times, we should be asking ourselves, shouldn't we, what is the life state of that person who is talking to so many hundreds of millions of people through television? And how much of this is wisdom, and how much of it is cleverness? So as I said earlier, people in society have to be, or should be, more careful than anybody else not to slander. So now I'll ask Bill to read the question first.
The guest, growing more indignant than ever, said...
Just a moment, Bill. By the way, it's page 16 of the Sacred Times that you've got. Left-hand column. Any of you who have got the new second volume of the Gosho, I made a note of the page somewhere. Where did I? Page 16, strangely enough, in the new volume 2 of the Gosho. Okay, Bill?
The guest, growing more indignant than ever, said, "A wise monarch, by acting in accord with heaven and earth, perfects his rule. A sage, by distinguishing between right and wrong, brings order to the world. The monks and priests of this world today enjoy the confidence of the entire empire. If they were in fact evil monks, then the wise ruler would put no trust in them. If they were not true sages, then men of worth and understanding would not look up to them. But now, since worthies and sages do in fact honor and respect them, they must be nothing less than paragons of their kind. Why then do you pour out these wild accusations and insist upon slandering them? Who are you referring to when you speak of evil monks? I would like an explanation.
Thank you. So you could feel the indignation of the traveller in the way he says at the end there, who are you referring to when you speak of evil monks? I would like an explanation. So the wise monarch, of course, today represents government or politicians. And I think we know that there are so many members of government, ministers and politicians, who, due to the nature of the life they have to lead, maybe, are in fact often far from wise. They have no philosophy, no rock on which to base their lives or their conclusions or their decisions. So they're pulled hither and thither, aren't they, by the political pressures that come on them day after day, week after week, and year by year. If they had the Gehonzen, what a difference it would make. Firstly, they would be basing their actions and their decisions, wouldn't they, on the rhythm of the universe, the rhythm of life itself. Secondly, they would have the perception to understand and appreciate the minds of the people and their needs. Thirdly, they would have the perception to understand the current of the times and the trends of society. And fourthly, and perhaps almost more important than anything else, they'd have the strength within themselves to resist the pressures of political life. So I wonder who it will be who will be the first politician of Myoho in Westminster. I can't wait for the day. What I'm sure of is that he or she will increasingly astound and influence his or her fellow politicians by their unique approach to problems. And I hope we don't have to wait too long. In this question, Nichiren Daishonin also mentions sages. Sages today, of course, are scholars, knowledgeable and, one hopes, wise people. I think it's a fact, and maybe you agree with me, that since the war, there has been a tremendous change in the scholastic world. I believe that before the war, and I know and remember quite a bit about that time, that there were scholars who, due to their upbringing and their education, had been encouraged to develop broad minds. Scholars who were able to cast their minds on a wide aspect of life itself. I think, in fact, Arnold Toynbee was one of those sort of scholars. But I believe it's true that since the war, education, like so many other things, has become specialized. From an early age at school, children are directed down a narrow channel. And this channel continues on through university and into life itself. Therefore, I believe we lack scholars, just in fact as we lack leaders, with this broad outlook and understanding of life as a whole, as a backcloth, as it were, to the specialist subject which they may deal with. So I would say that we have tended to become very narrow in the educational world and the scholarly world due to the educational system which has grown since the last war. This, of course, is a tragedy. Nothing should interfere with education, but unfortunately education, like everything else at the moment, comes under political pressure. A scholar, like the wise monarch, should be able to feel, due to his wide understanding, the rhythm of the times. Otherwise, he's liable to make false judgment. So again, who, I wonder, is going to be the first great scholar of Myoho in the United Kingdom? Or the first great educational reformer? I can't wait for the moment to meet him or her. So the conclusion really to what we've said so far is that so long as influential people in society, scholars or government leaders, are narrow in their outlook, they cannot and never will truly understand the rhythm of the times. Therefore, the conclusions that they reach and the philosophy or teachings that they spread or the acts that they make are inevitably going to be narrow and rigid too. If the minds of society's leaders are impure or narrow, then inevitably society itself will be impure or narrow. And of course, just as the gosho says, that means too that the land will be impure. Why is it that this narrowness on the part of leaders should restrict the people themselves? After all, the people themselves have their own minds. But I feel this is inevitable, because the narrow minds of society's leaders lead to the imposition, firstly, of a moral code. So their view on life, rather than being natural, must be imposed by precepts or commandments, a code of conduct. Secondly, it leads to a rigid system of laws. And thirdly, it inevitably leads to a tighter and tighter bureaucratic control over the people. To me, this is like 3 layers of a very heavy, overcooked cake. So this has happened, of course, for centuries. If one looks at history, especially of Europe, in so many different countries, this has occurred. And we see the results of it carrying on today. Out of this restriction and narrowness, of course, life force, natural life force, is lost. People feel confined and fettered. They become distressed and sometimes even desperate. Their natural life force becomes lower and lower and lower. Through this, they can't so easily face challenges when they're really serious ones, or steer the right course for the happiness of their countries. No power or resilience exists anymore. And this apathy, of course, that results from it breeds even more evil in the form of the lust for power of a privileged few. We see this all over the world, and it's no need to give more examples. I believe in this country we have kept our freedom better than most. So really we need to make sure that we don't allow it to be shaved away anymore. So how can we produce wise monarchs and sages? It's impossible, isn't it? Having heard these arguments that Nichiren Daishonin is stating in this gosho, it's impossible without a correct, all-embracing philosophy on which such people can base their lives and their actions. So really, It's such a philosophy which aerates that heavy solid cake I was talking about. So the teaching of such a philosophy, of course, is the mission or role of a Buddha, or in Japanese terms, a shonin, a supreme or enlightened teacher. Such a person is able to stand back and through his own enlightenment teach the true way of life, which is in rhythm with the law of the universe. And looking back over history, there have been not so many cases where such a person appeared. But certainly one could say that in the reign of King Ashoka, who was a most enlightened king, the state of his lands and his kingdom was supremely prosperous and happy. So really one can't help coming to the conclusion that there is only one all-embracing philosophy which can truly apply itself to every human problem and condition today, and that is the teaching of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. There is no other. So we feel so uncomfortable about that sometimes. In a sense, it's against our English nature of allowing everybody to be free to do what they like. But still that shouldn't prevent us from believing that there can be only one real truth, and there is only one way to really get at it, and that is through Nichiren Daishonin's teachings. And of course, this is what the Buddha Shakyamuni, with his great and worldly wisdom, this is what he preached 3,000 years ago. So any wise monarch or sage will be so if they are putting their life in rhythm with the life of the universe itself. It stands to reason, doesn't it? So now, the key lines, as you see, of this question are those last three. Who are you referring to when you speak of evil monks? I would like an explanation. And this Nichiren Daishonin proceeds to give in the answer. And the answer is a justification through documentary proof of Nichiren Daishonin's attack on the Nembutsu sect. Later in the Gosho, he also refutes other sects. And we don't need to go into these refutations in great detail. It's unlikely that we're going to have to do a battle in a debate with a Nembutsu follower. But of course, it was extremely important that Nichiren Daishonin should give detailed proof of the validity of what he was saying, because in those days in Japan, and over the next 700 years, there were plenty of Japanese members who had to engage followers of Nembutsu in debate about the true teaching. Nevertheless, if we listen to this answer, it gives us, most important of all, the spirit and the conviction of Nichiren Daishonin. And we should bear in mind all the time that Nembutsu, after all, is only representative of many other false and incomplete teachings. So now we'll read this answer, then we'll have a break, and then we'll consider the answer. Thank you, Bill.
The host said, in the reign of Emperor Gotoba, there was a priest named Honen who wrote a work entitled the Senchaku Shu. He contradicted the sacred teachings of Shakyamuni and brought confusion to persons in every direction. The Senchaku Shu states, the Chinese priest Tao Cho distinguished between the Shodo or sacred way teachings and the Jodo or pure land teachings, and urged men to abandon the former and immediately embrace the latter. First of all, there are two kinds of sacred way teachings, the Mahayana and the Hinayana. Judging from this, we may assume that the esoteric Mahayana doctrines of Shingon and the true Mahayana teachings of the Lotus Sutra are both included in the sacred way. If that is so, then the present-day sects of Shingon, Zen, Tendai, Kegon, Sanron, Hosso, Jiron, and Shoron, all these 8 schools are included in the sacred way that is to be abandoned. The priest Tan Luan, in his Ojo Ronchu, states, I note that Nagarjuna's Juju Bibhasha Ron says there are two ways by which the bodhisattva may reach the state in which there is no retrogression. One is the difficult to practice way, the other is the easy to practice way. The difficult to practice way is the same as the sacred way, and the easy to practice way is the Pure Land. Students of the Pure Land sect should first of all understand this point. Though they may previously have studied teachings belonging to the sacred way, if they wish to become followers of the Pure Land school, they must discard the sacred way and give their allegiance to the Pure Land teachings. Honen also says, the Chinese priest Shan Tao distinguished between correct and incorrect practices and urged men to embrace the former and abandon the latter. Concerning the first of the incorrect practices, that of reading and reciting the sutra, he states that with the exception of the recitation of the Kamuryo-ju Sutra and the other Pure Land Sutras, the embracing and recitation of all sutras, whether Mahayana or Hinayana, exoteric or esoteric, is to be regarded as an incorrect practice. Concerning the third of the incorrect practices, that of worshipping, he states that with the exception of worshipping the Buddha Amida, the worshipping or honoring of any of the other Buddhas, bodhisattvas or deities of the heavenly and human worlds is to be regarded as an incorrect practice. In the light of this passage, it's clear that one should abandon such incorrect practices and concentrate upon the practice of the Pure Land teaching. What reason would we have to abandon the correct practices of the Pure Land teaching, which ensure that out of 100 persons, all 100 will be reborn in the Western paradise and cling instead to the various incorrect practices and procedures which could not save even one person in 1,000? Followers of the way should ponder this carefully. Honen further states, in the Jogen Nyuzo Roku, we find it recorded that from the 600 volumes of the Daihanya Sutra to the Hojoju Sutra, the exoteric and esoteric sutras of the Mahayana Buddhism total 637 works in 2,883 volumes. All of these should now be replaced by the recitation of the single Mahayana phrase, the nembutsu. You should understand that when the Buddha was adapting his teachings to his various listeners, he for a time taught the two methods of concentrated meditation and unconcentrated meditation. But later, when he taught according to his own enlightenment, he ceased to teach these two methods. The only teaching that once revealed shall never cease to be taught is the single doctrine of the nembutsu. Again, Honen states, the passage which says that the practitioner of the nembutsu must possess three kinds of mind is found in the Kanmuryo-ju Sutra. In the commentary on that sutra we read, someone asked if there are those who differ in understanding and practice from the followers of the nembutsu, persons of heretical and mistaken belief, how can one make certain that their perverse and differing views will not cause trouble? We also see that these evil persons, with their different understanding and different practices, are compared to a band of robbers who call back the travellers who have already gone one or two steps along their way. In my opinion, when these passages speak of different understanding, different practices, varying doctrines and varying beliefs, they are referring to the teachings of the sacred way. Finally, in a concluding passage, Honen says, if one wishes to escape quickly from the sufferings of life and death, one should confront these two superior teachings and then proceed to put aside the teachings of the sacred way and choose those of the Pure Land. And if one wishes to follow the teachings of the Pure Land, one should confront the correct and incorrect practices and then proceed to abandon all those that are incorrect and devote one's entire attention to those that are correct. When we examine these passages, we see that Honen quotes the erroneous explanations of Tanluan, Taocho, and Shanto, and establishes the categories he calls sacred way and pure land, difficult to practice way and easy to practice way. He then takes all the 637 works in 2,883 volumes that comprise the Mahayana Sutras of the Buddha's lifetime, including those of the Lotus Sutra and Shingon, along with all the Buddhas, bodhisattvas and deities of the heavenly and human worlds, and assigns them all to the sacred way The difficult to practice way